There is a woman inside Buckingham Palace who does not fight for attention. She does not pose for cameras before she is ready. She does not leak stories to tabloids or send messages through carefully placed wardrobe choices. She just shows up to conflict zones, to refugee camps, to hospital wards in countries most people cannot find on a map, and she does the work. Her name is Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, and for years the British press treated her like an afterthought, a footnote. The quiet wife of the youngest prince. But something began to shift inside the royal family, quietly at first, then with the force of something long overdue. And when a request came from the most powerful woman now sitting at the center of that family, a request that touched the memory of the most beloved royal who ever lived, Sophie did not simply comply. She stood her ground, and in doing so she reminded the world exactly who she is, and exactly whose legacy she has always been quietly, faithfully carrying forward. To understand what happened, you have to first understand how much Diana still matters. Not Diana as a museum piece, not Diana as a black and white photograph hung on a charity wall, but Diana as a living presence inside the corridors of royal duty. Princess Diana died in 1997, but her way of doing things, her instinct for going directly to the people who were suffering, her refusal to treat compassion as a performance, did not die with her. It survived. And it survived most visibly, most persistently, in the woman who many believe resembles her not just in appearance but in spirit. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, has been described by royal biographers and palace insiders as the closest thing the modern royal family has to what Diana represented. A royal who genuinely goes to the difficult places, who sits with the people who are hurting, and who does not let the constraints of palace protocol stop her from doing what feels human and necessary. The physical resemblance between Sophie and Diana became a documented and rather extraordinary part of royal history in 2025, when biographer Sean Smith released his book simply titled Sophie, Saving the Royal Family. In it, Smith revealed a detail that had been quietly known inside palace circles for years, but had never been fully explained to the public. Sophie did not attend Princess Diana's funeral in September 1997. At the time, this absence was noticed, quietly questioned, and then largely forgotten in the grief and chaos of that devastating week. Smith's biography finally offered the explanation. Sophie had been advised and herself agreed that her striking physical resemblance to Diana would have been too upsetting for the hundreds of thousands of mourners lining the procession route. The thought of a woman walking past who looked so much like the princess who had just died, it was considered too painful, too disorienting for a grieving public. And so Sophie stayed away, not because she did not want to be there, not because she did not feel the loss, but because she was already, in that early and profound moment, thinking about other people before herself. That quality, that instinct to absorb personal cost for the sake of others, became the defining characteristic of everything she would do in the decades that followed. By the time Sophie married Prince Edward in 1999, 2 years after Diana's death, she was already navigating one of the most difficult positions any woman could occupy in the British royal family. The family was still deep in the shadow of grief and public anger. The monarchy's reputation had taken serious damage in the aftermath of Diana's death, with many Britons furious at how the royal family had initially responded to the tragedy. Sophie walked into this institution at one of its most vulnerable moments. She had no royal blood, no grand title waiting for her, no obvious blueprint for what her role should be. What she had was her own instincts, her own values, and eventually a model, albeit a bittersweet one, in the form of Diana's legacy. Over the following 2 decades, Sophie built what royal experts have called one of the most genuinely impactful charitable portfolios of any working royal. She became the patron of more than 70 charities and organizations, but the numbers do not capture what made her work different. She did not simply lend her name and her photograph. She traveled. She went to Sierra Leone, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kosovo, and Bangladesh. She sat with survivors of sexual violence in conflict zones, held the hands of women who had been through things most people cannot imagine, and then stood up in front of cameras and spoke about what she had heard, not performing emotion, but clearly carrying it, visibly affected, committed to making sure those women's stories reached somewhere they could make a difference. In October 2024, she became the first member of the British royal family to visit Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion began in 2022. She met with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and torture, listening in the way that Diana used to listen, not with the polished detachment of an official visit, but with the raw, unguarded attention of someone who actually wanted to know. The parallel to Diana runs even deeper than geography or cause. Diana was famous for touching people, for abandoning the stiff, hands-off formality that had historically defined royal encounters, and instead reaching out to hold someone's hand, hug a child, sit at eye level with a patient in a hospital bed. Sophie does this too, so naturally that it barely registers as unusual anymore. At the 2024 Paris Olympics, she was photographed hugging a spectator in the crowd with the kind of spontaneous warmth that royal protocol technically discourages. In November 2024, at the National Service of Remembrance, a moment that quietly captured enormous public attention showed Sophie placing her arm around Princess Catherine as the two of them stepped back from the Remembrance Sunday balcony together. Catherine had been in the middle of recovering from cancer treatment. She was gradually returning to public duties and clearly still carrying the physical and emotional weight of an extraordinarily difficult year. Sophie's gesture, simple, instinctive arm around a shoulder, felt like something Diana would have done, and it was received that way. That same Remembrance Sunday event carried additional significance because of who was not there. Queen Camilla had been sidelined with a chest infection, and Sophie stepped in to take her place beside Catherine on the balcony. It was a moment that crystallized something the royal watching world had been discussing for months. Sophie's role within the family had expanded enormously, and it had done so at exactly the moment when the family needed that expansion most. King Charles had been dealing with his own cancer diagnosis. Catherine had been going through chemotherapy. The family's senior working ranks were depleted. Sophie and Prince Edward stepped into the gap with a steadiness and a lack of drama that earned them praise from royal commentators across the spectrum. But it was in this expanding role that tensions with Queen Camilla began to surface, not through explosive confrontations or leaked palace dramas, but through a series of smaller moments and reported disagreements that revealed something real about how the two women navigate their very different positions and very different instincts. Camilla, now queen consort, sits at the top of the royal women's hierarchy. She has authority, precedence, and the institutional power that comes with being the wife of the king, and she has used that position in ways that have occasionally ruffled feathers. Reports emerged, circulated by well-sourced royal journalists, that Camilla had established certain expectations about how the other royal women presented themselves at official engagements, including which colors they wore. Royal dressers, it was reported, became cautious about allowing any of the other women to wear royal blue at the same time as Camilla, given that it was the queen's preferred color, and she had first right of selection within the royal pecking order. The rule was eventually relaxed somewhat, but its existence alone was telling. It reflected a style of authority that was about hierarchy and precedence, about who comes first. Sophie's style of authority is almost the precise opposite. Where Camilla tends toward the traditional structures of royal precedence, she is the queen, there is an order to things, and that order should be respected. Sophie operates from a more instinctive place. She is not interested in the order for its own sake. She is interested in the work. Royal author Katie Nishal, who has tracked Sophie's trajectory for years, has described her as a vital presence within the family, a woman who is easygoing, never dramatic, and quietly formidable in her commitment to her causes. Nishal has also described Sophie as the family's peacekeeper, someone who has navigated the fierce internal feuds between William and Harry, between the palace and the Sussex household, without taking sides, without leaking, without adding to the chaos. That quality of steadiness, of remaining focused on what actually matters rather than who has precedence and power, became particularly relevant when Camilla's requests began to bump up against Sophie's commitments. The tension crystallized most visibly around Sophie's humanitarian work and her visible honoring of Diana's charitable legacy. Camilla has her own charitable focus areas and her own public identity, carefully and sometimes painfully constructed over decades of being, in the public imagination, the woman who hurt Diana. She has worked hard to rehabilitate that image, and by most measures she has succeeded. She has become queen consort, she has carved out a role for herself, and she is respected if not universally beloved. But she has never fully escaped Diana's shadow, and she never will. The British public's love for Diana is not something that fades with time. If anything, it has deepened, becoming more mythologized with each passing year. And every time Sophie does something that echoes Diana, the humanitarian travel, the frontline charity work, the instinctive human warmth with ordinary people. It draws that comparison into the public conversation in ways that are uncomfortable for Camilla's carefully managed position. When Camilla put forward a request, and the specifics, as is often the case with internal royal matters, have not been fully confirmed but have been described by sources close to the palace as relating to how Diana's memory should be publicly honored and how royal women should manage their public profiles in relation to it, Sophie's response was clear. She was not going to let institutional concerns override genuine tribute. She was not going to allow palace politics to reshape the honest, ground-level work she had committed herself to. The request, as reported and understood by those familiar with the situation, was declined. Quietly, without drama, in the way Sophie does everything with dignity and without creating a spectacle. What made that refusal so significant was everything that surrounded it. In 2025, Sophie turned 60 years old. The milestone prompted a wave of reflection in the royal press about what she had built and who she had become. Plan International UK, one of the world's largest children's charities, had just announced Sophie as its new royal patron, a role that would take her to the Chad-Sudan border to witness the displacement crisis firsthand, to meet young women and girls who had fled the violence in Sudan and were now living as refugees. The UN Commission on the Status of Women, which she attended in New York in 2026, described her as a global ambassador and a champion of the women, peace, and security agenda. These were not ceremonial roles. They were active, demanding, sometimes dangerous commitments that required real travel to real places and real engagement with real suffering. And throughout all of it, the name that kept appearing in the commentary and the reflection was Diana. Not as a comparison Sophie herself encouraged. She is far too careful and too humble for that, but as something that emerged naturally from watching what she does and how she does it. Diana believed that the role of a royal was not to stand above suffering, but to stand beside it. Sophie has lived that belief across more than 2 decades and more than 70 charitable commitments. She has been to the countries Diana never reached, the conflicts Diana never lived to witness, the causes Diana laid the groundwork for but could not complete. When Sophie stood in a refugee camp on the Chad-Sudan border, when she sat with a survivor of sexual violence in Ukraine, when she placed her arm around a recovering Princess Catherine on a November balcony in London, she was doing something that went beyond duty or protocol. She was continuing a conversation that Diana started, in her own language, in her own way, with the full weight of who she is behind it. That is what made her decision to reject Camilla's request, whatever its precise nature, so resonant with those who watched it unfold. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was not ambition or political maneuvering or a desire to embarrass anyone. It was simply a woman who knew what she was doing and why she was doing it, and who was not willing to let the machinery of royal hierarchy change that. In a family that has often been accused of prioritizing image over substance, Sophie continues to insist, quietly, consistently, without making a fuss, on substance above all. Diana would have understood that entirely. And in that understanding, perhaps, is the truest form of legacy. Not a photograph on a wall, not a title passed down, but a way of being in the world that proves it is possible to be both royal and deeply, genuinely human, all at once.